Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Mr. LaCrosse. That's the first time I ever heard Johnny Cash for special music. He did do some religious songs, along with some of the others. Good to be here with you in Michigan. See old friends, new friends, people I taught ABC, some I taught at Ambassador College, some I met in different parts of the world. It's always good to be out with God's people, especially in the holy days. And the plan of God is so special. This is one thing that Mr. Armstrong thought was the greatest gift God gave him, was actually understanding the plan through the holy days, and how he remembered keeping unleavened bread for several years by himself with his wife and putting leaven out and having no idea why, except God said to do it. Which, if God says to do it and you don't know why, that's kind of a good thing to do. And you'll figure it out later, as he did when you come through. Had a couple of sermons I was going to thought about giving. I was talking to my wife this morning. I thought about talking about the sermon when I thought she was taken into the white slave trade, but that's another story. So I thought I'd switch and give one I gave in Ann Arbor a week ago, because we live in an ungodly world, and we're trying to put sin out and do things, and all the people of God throughout history have had to do that of sorts. One of the Psalms that I memorized when I was young, was Psalms 23, which you're all familiar with. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in the green pastures beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in his paths for righteousness' sake, in his name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for God is with me. It was in the song we just heard. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Thou prepares the table before me in the presence of my enemies, which is something God does. You anoint my head with oil, my cup runs over, and surely goodness and mercy will be with me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. David said that, and he loved the God he recognized and knew at that time who would die for him and for all of us. It's difficult to live righteously in an ungodly world. Growing up in the church, my life was much different than my wife's, in the sense that she came to college not knowing anything about the church at age 18, and I came to college having already had all the Bible classes and everything since I was a little child, because I grew up in the church. My dad died when I was 4 years old, and my mom was told to move to Big Sandy in 1956, where the Imperial Schools was and the widows were. And so at the funeral, right after that, we moved down to Big Sandy, and there were only a few hundred people in the church at that time. And I was a little kid running around and getting to know all the people there. And the church had a grade school and a high school at that time. And so I had 12 years of Imperial Schools. I had two started out in Big Sandy in 58 to 60 and went to Pasadena. My mom, as a widow, moved to Pasadena. And I often wonder why she did, although I think I figured it out. Being a widow and being down there with a whole bunch of other widows and not many men around, the pickings are pretty slim. So she moved to Pasadena, I think, to find a stepfather for us, and which she did. And I did Imperial Schools out in Pasadena for the next 10 years until I graduated from Imperial Schools. And during that time, I memorized a lot of the Bible, because I had Bible class every day of my life pretty much. Monday through Friday at school, and church on the weekends, and my dad had Bible studies in the morning for us, which most of the time I slept through, which irritated him to no end. And it didn't irritate him I slept, but he gave a test at the end of the week, and I always got all the answers right, and my mom and brother, who tried to stay awake, didn't get them right. So that was disconcerting for him. But it was really good for me. I didn't have a problem with that at all. I mean, if you can learn it in your sleep, whatever works for you. It worked for me. But we memorized Psalm 23 all the time, every year, and we memorized all the other chapters. And if you finished getting all the stars across the board before the school year ended, they added chapters, and one year they added Psalms 119, which really isn't a lot of fun. Makes you wish you hadn't quite finished so early. And that one I still don't know that well, because I only had to do it once, thankfully. A long, long thing. But we did that. In some form or another, each of us walks through the valley of the shadow of death. And we have to face evil. And we have to learn to be righteous in an ungodly world. With me, as a child, though, I loved the stories in the Bible. Again, we went over and over and over in Imperial. And I loved, hearing about Noah building the ark and, being saved, and about Abraham and the promise given to him of a son, and going down to Joseph into Egypt and being the head of Egypt, and then, of course, Moses and parting the Red Sea. I thought, wow, how great it would be. And then, Daniel in the lion's den, and all the prophets, Deborah, Barak, Samson, all of the people, back when God did things. That's kind of the way I looked at it as a kid. Back then, God did things, Well, I wish he'd do that again. And I've never seen the Red Sea parted or anything. I've swam in it a few times, but I haven't seen it part. And but as a kid, you tend to think that way. Back in biblical times, God did all this stuff, and I thought, boy, it would be great to be there. And so by the time I graduated, I really knew the stories super, super well, and they've held me in good stead because I've always used the stories to be able to find a solution to the problems that I faced. And I think you've probably done the same thing, I hope at least, because those stories, like Paul wrote, he says, those stories were for examples for us. And he still does those things today. And so I want to talk today, one of my favorite characters in the Bible. I'm going to go to Daniel, which we've all read. And when I was young, we spent a lot of time in the later chapters of Daniel trying to figure out the king of the north, the king of the south, the 70 weeks prophecy. I was a numbers guy as a kid, so to me, I knew when the world was going to end and Christ was going to come, and he's a little overdue. But the thing is the numbers were great, except the numbers really don't do anything for you. It's the first 6 chapters of Daniel that really help you get in the kingdom. And so that's what I want to look at today, is the first 6 chapters of Daniel, and look at his life and to understand exactly what he went through and how God helped him, how the Savior you and I have dealt with him. And looking at what he did and thinking, how can we look at our lives similar to his? You see, Daniel was taken captive in Babylon. The captivity, there are 3 different captivities or times that Babylonians came, the final one being in 585 BC. But Daniel was taken captive, and he was taken by the king. And kings back at that time, they would capture people, they would replace them, but they would also capture the documents, the scrolls, the books, all the knowledge. Knowledge was important that they built on, so all those things were taken by Babylon, but they would also take a lot of the young people, that were talented people, to learn their language, to be, to learn and help take care of the country as such. And so Daniel was one of those people, and he went to Babylon. And in Daniel 1:3, we're told about what happened when he was taken there. And again, most of us have been transplanted from one place to another. I mean, I was transplanted when my dad died to Big Sandy, and then to Pasadena, and then I was transplanted on a daily basis working with Mr. Armstrong. But, it's tough. It's stress to move and do things. And when you think about your life and what God is doing to you, in my life, my father wasn't interested in the church. My mom became interested, and she was fascinated by it, and she had never read the Bible. I wasn't named after Aaron in the Bible. I was named after an old black man down the road that was named Aaron. She thought the name was nice, and that's how I got named. And she found out that it was in the Bible later. So don't think there's some big spiritual thing why I got named Aaron. But that was what it was. But my father, he was a star athlete in high school. He went to Morgantown Western University. He actually was drafted by the Lakers to play basketball. And he didn't, because they didn't pay anything in the 50s, and he wanted to get married and have a family. And so my father wasn't interested in the church at all, and my dad had a stroke when I was about 1, and he was supposed to die. I mean, the doctors said, he's dead, he's going to die. It's a massive stroke. And so the dean side of the family, my mom was kind of criticized for religion. They basically disinherited her and disowned her, and so she kept praying for him, and God healed him. And that was an amazing thing, and he went back to work, and 2 years later he gets killed in a construction accident. Like, they had a trial for murder because they don't know if it was murder or accident. He was smashed between a wall and a runaway crane. Ball and crane goes 3 miles an hour under full power, and so they had a trial, and all the pictures of my father somewhere in a vault with Indiana Jones and all the strange things that the government keeps. So I didn't have a whole lot of pictures of him and things, but if my dad had lived, I probably would never come into the church. I'd probably been playing ball and sports and things, because I was good at it. But and I always wonder why God healed him just to kill him a couple years later. But you don't know what God's doing in your life until you look back and you see what happens there. And so my life changed dramatically with that, and I made new friends, and they were all church friends. And I never knew any of the, I didn't have to learn paganism. My wife could teach me that. She knew all about it. But I didn't keep Christmas trees, although my mom did when I was down there 4 years old when she moved to Big Sandy. It always shocked me. Mr. Koch said that you had to practically walk on water to be in the church because my mom didn't know anything about, she knew about Christmas and Easter, but nobody told her about Halloween, so she dressed us up as little characters and sent us to all the church members' homes. And we didn't get anything. None of them gave us any candy. I mean, it was, and then somebody finally told her that, well, Halloween is not really good either. So, we learned as we went along. And that's the only time I ever did trick-or-treating, but and it wasn't a fun experience not getting anything. But I was in Imperial schools. Well, Daniel was kind of like that, and he was taken captive, and he didn't know what God was doing in his life. When you read Daniel, it talks about how God did all these things, and he's writing this when he's an older person looking back. I always wonder, when did Daniel finally know God was doing some of these things as such? But let's go to Daniel 1, verse 3, because Daniel was in one of the early captivities, and I wonder if that was purposely, considering God, what he was going to do with him and preparing him. But Daniel didn't know. It's hard to leave everything you know. In fact, I mean, if I'm Daniel, okay, God's really helping me. He's made me captive. He's destroyed my city. He's taken all my family. He's brought me into captivity. And he's made me a eunuch. Boy, God's really helping me. I mean, I'm sure he didn't think that way. So we all have some of those things that we think about. In verse 3, the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of the eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed and of the princes, children in whom was no blemish, well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge and understanding science, and such as had the ability in them to stand in the king's palace, in whom they might teach the learning of the tongues of the Chaldeans. See, Daniel most likely was of royal blood. Most likely he was trained by the priest in Jerusalem and knew those things. He was trained by their imperial schools at the time, I imagine, and he was intelligent. And you can learn a lot of things academically. And he did. I did. I learned a lot of things academically. When I could have answered all the baptism questions by the time I was 10, 12 years old, but I wouldn't have internalized it. I didn't know anything, but academically. And so being in the palace as he was, he had access to the scrolls and the writings that they took from Jerusalem, so he had those to work with. In verse 5, the king appointed them daily provisions of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, nourishing them 3 years. At the end of that time, they might stand before the king. Among these were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, unto whom the prince of the eunuchs gave them names. He gave the name to Daniel, the name of Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, of Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. Again, this was commonly done when you took a country to take them out of their culture, give them a different language, different things, so they wouldn't go back and that they could work with the country. Not an unusual thing. Verse 8, though, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. He knew the scrolls, he knew about clean and unclean meats, and he chose to observe those things. Now again, there are a whole lot of Judah captivities. In captivity, how many of them gave up what they believed? I mean, like, hey, God's deserted me. I'm over here. Why should I worry about this? But Daniel didn't. And now, verse 9, God brought Daniel into favor and tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. Again, I don't think he knew that at the time. He's writing this looking back and saying, I have favor with this guy, because he understood it later on after God did that. God was watching. And again, his whole life was upside down. So what would you think if God did that to you? That, oh, God's blessing me. Well, later in life, Daniel saw what God was doing and understood that. And the prince of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who has appointed your meat and drink. Why should he see your faces worse, liking like the children which are of your sort? And you shall make me endanger my head to the king. People always worry about themselves. They wonder, what's going to happen to me? I was reminded of a girl that I taught in college in the 90s, and she got hired, and she wrote me and told me that she was hired by this lawyer. And she was shocked because as soon as he hired her, he gave her the applications of all the people that he turned down for the job. And in that was some 4.0s from Harvard and 4.0s from Yale and 4.0s from Columbia, these great schools. And she asked him, "Why did you choose me?" And he said, "I was really impressed with you, but you got to realize my head is on the line. Because if you fail, I can get fired. If I'd hired the 4.0 from Harvard, I'd say, well, look at this 4.0 from Harvard. Who would you have hired? But I hired this girl from this little tiny school that has this funny religion." But he says, "You impressed me." So people are worried about that. And that's what the eunuch was worried about as well. And so Daniel 1 verse 11, he said to Melzar, the prince of the eunuchs, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Prove your servants, I beseech you, 10 days. Let them give us the pulse to eat and water to drink, not the delicacy of Babylon." And I've seen the delicacy around the world and didn't really want to eat them, even if I didn't know the clean and unclean laws. Monkey brain has never been attractive to me. But the things that people eat, they do that. Let our countenance be looked upon before you, and the countenance of the others that eat the king's portion of meat, as you see, deal with us. So it's fine, let us eat this, and if we're bad, we don't want you to be in danger, you can deal with us that time. At the end of 10 days, their countenance appeared fairer and flatter in flesh than all the children which ate the portion of the king's meat. And I really always told people I'd love to have that 10-day diet. It would be really helpful. But we don't know what it was, and God helped them. So Melzar took away the portion of their meat and the wine that they should drink, gave them what they asked for. And often God gives us some early tests in our life so that we can find out what we're going to be. Not so difficult. This was just your diet. And are you going to keep what the law that you know you should or not? A simple test. And I don't know that Daniel even knew it was a test, really, at the time that he did this. But again, writing much later, he looks back and says this to us. And in verse 18, or verse 17, "For these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had an understanding in all visions and dreams." Again, did they know that God was doing this at that time? Or were they just the A students in the class as such? Now at the end of the days that the king had said he should bring them, the prince of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And the king communed with them. And among them all was found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And therefore they stood before the king. But again, they weren't really elevated this high at that time. Verse 20, "In all matters of wisdom and understanding, that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm." Again, do you stand out among the people that you work with? When I was young, my junior year of high school, I was manager of Allied Van Lines, the warehouse. They had me setting everything up, and all the truckers would come in and start swearing and stuff like truckers because they were truckers. And my boss heard them going at it one day, and I was around the corner. I heard him say, "Hey, shh, be quiet, the kid's a Christian," which was good. I didn't want to hear all that stuff anyway. But the thing is do people recognize what you believe? Do you stand out? And these kids stood out. And again, did they know at the time? I don't know. What did it feel like to be chosen, though, to go before the king? They were still pretty low-level servants at this time, but they found favor, and they were talking to the king. Did they really know God was going to do anything with them at this point in their lives? I doubt it. I'm sure they were excited, and things were going. But they probably saw themselves as staff, just part of the group that were there. It was exciting, but again, their country had been destroyed. They had a different take on life than they had had some 10 years before when things seemed better. Again, many of you have been recognized for your work ethic, for your honesty, your spiritual values that you believe in, the fruits of God's Spirit working in you. And again, it's an evil world around us, and we get that. They try to rub that off on us and judge us, but do you stand up like the 4 young men there in Babylon did? You may wonder if God helped you get a certain job or put you in a certain place or not. I know the excitement and the fear that comes with that. When I was asked to fly on the church's Gulfstream jet, I had no notice. I was asked to fly on graduation day on Friday, and I was supposed to go out in the field. They paged a formal brunch they had for graduation. They paged me and had me come up to the counter, and I figured I was in trouble because nobody got paged during the special brunch, and I didn't really know how much trouble I was in. But it was Mr. Armstrong, and I said, hello, and he said, do you know who this is? And I said, well, yes. And he said, what are your plans? And I said, I'm supposed to go to Salt Lake City on Sunday. And he said, well, I want you to fly on my plane. And I said, well, I was supposed to leave Sunday for Salt Lake City. He said, well, they'll understand. And Monday, 8 o'clock in the morning, we took off for Europe. And went there, and it was supposed to be a 3-week trip. And 6 weeks later, we're still over there. We'd already gone to England and Belgium and Jordan and Israel and Spain. And I served King Leopold, and I served the Princess Anne. And we met with King Carlos of Spain. And we fly into Paris, and Mr. Armstrong, I'm supposed to get married this weekend. So I flew home from Paris to get married, which was probably par for the course considering the next 7 years of my life. But and I did get there, man. She did marry me. She didn't say no, thankfully. But maybe she wished she had some of those times. But there are pitfalls in life. And but the excitement of being there and being introduced to a king or whatever, there's some excitement. There's also fear with that. First time I was introduced to King Bhumibol of Thailand, Mr. Armstrong introduced me as, this is Aaron D., my aide. He's a product of what I feel like those little ballerinas and thing getting spun around and looked at. I mean, I never thought of myself as a product as such, but I was. I mean, I did. I had 12 years of imperial and 4 years of ambassador and working for him, so I'm a product, and hopefully I'm not recalled. But it is the fear that goes with it. You don't know what you're doing. I mean, nobody knows protocol in 50 or 60 countries, and I had to do a lot of that in my life. But it was strange. Again, when I got asked to fly on the plane, though, my stepfather told me something. He'd told me before, but he made it really clear. He said, separate salvation from people. He says, you're going to see and hear things that are going to shake you. It'll be wrong in some cases, but it's not God that's wrong. Separate salvation from people. He said, if you were there when Abraham lied about his wife, that she's his sister, I don't want any of that. If you were there when David's committing adultery and killing Uriah, well, I sure don't want to follow him. If you're there when Peter denied Christ, well, I don't want to be with him. But because everybody makes mistakes, so separate salvation from people because there's pitfalls everywhere. And all of us face some of those pitfalls in life. Daniel 2 tells of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And that's probably, to me, it was a test of faith for Daniel. Because when you read what Daniel had to do, and here we are in the second year, chapter 2, verse 1, the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed a dream, wherewith his spirits troubled and his sleep broke from him, and he commanded all the magicians and astrologers and sorcerers and Chaldeans to show him his dream. And so they stood before him, and he said, I dreamed a dream, and my spirit's troubled. Tell me what the dream is. Verse 4, the Chaldeans said to the king, tell us your dream, and we'll tell you the interpretation. Now, if you tell me a dream, I can make up something pretty easily. And that's what most soothsayers do. They can make up all these generic things that seem to fit. And he could have, the head of gold, that's you. And the silver, that's the people you're ruling. I mean, you can make up something that would sound pretty good. But he didn't tell them the dream. And that kind of bothered them. And again, that's what most soothsayers and people do. They want some information so that they can, make up something that fits. And that Mr. Armstrong did that to me a few times. Once he told me to find something that Jesus Christ said to someone about something. And I thought, well, that's kind of vague. And we ended up reading the whole New Testament. He said, well, I don't know where it is, but just start reading Matthew. So we read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And well, maybe it was Paul. And so he read all of Paul. I mean, he just wanted to read the Bible, I think, because he couldn't do it for himself. But it's interesting when you get a challenge that doesn't fit. But Nebuchadnezzar had a temper. I mean, he had a major problem with temper. And basically, he told the soothsayers, you tell me this dream and what it means, or I'm going to kill you all. And again, Daniel and his friends weren't there when that happened, because later Daniel has to ask, verse 14, the decree went forth, and verse 13, they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. And Daniel asked, why did they do this? Verse 13, why is he going to slay everybody? And verse 15, he answered and said to Arioch, why is the decree so hasty from the king? And Arioch made the thing known to Daniel. He told him what happened. They're going to kill you all. Daniel went in and desired of the king that he would give him time, that he would show the king the interpretation. How would you like to go in and say, okay, give me some time, God will tell me. Really? I mean, he hadn't been told the dream. He didn't know yet. I mean, he was acting on faith that God would do it. And of course, God did. And when you ask for help, do you know God's going to help you? Do you really? Mr. Armstrong several times would ask me, how's the trip going along? Is everything going well? And I just say yes. I had no idea. And I would just say, God, if you want him to see these people, work it out. And because he didn't want to hear anything other than that, so I just told him what he wanted to hear. But and that's what we were doing. And God made it work. But you have to really know that God is going to help you in that. And Daniel was going to be slain. And he stepped on a limb and said, hey, I'll tell you, give me a day or two. That is an act of faith, a major act of faith. And it's an act of faith that you and I have to have sometimes in our lives as we go through that. And I wonder if the stories that he read in the scrolls about Moses and Abraham and all that gave him the courage to say, God's going to do this for me. Did he use the examples that he had at that time? Or did he also think, boy, back then when God was making Israel great and parting the Red Sea instead of destroying Jerusalem, he may have thought that way, but he did it. You know, it's when you look at that, you have to have the courage to do this. You know, God is not at our beck and call. We are at his. God knows what he's going to do. He has to learn what you're going to do. And he does it through the various tests that he have. And again, we know that God revealed the dream to him, and he told the king that he was the head of gold and the empires that would come afterwards, and certainly all those are proved out. One of the proofs of the Bible is that God, several hundred years before, tells of all the kingdoms that are rising. And I'm sure at this time, he really knew and understood that God was there and was helping him. And I'm sure it built his courage. Everything you go through and God delivers you builds your faith for the next event. And I've always told people that, please God, let this be my test and not my preparation for one, because they get tougher. They always do. And some are financial, some are spiritual, some are emotional. And you don't know what God is going to do. But he has to know that you're trusting him. You believe in him, that you know that his son who died for you is going to deliver you. And God, when he was doing these things for them, he was delivering them and helping them. The next story we read about in Daniel is legendary. It's in Daniel 3, the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And I'm not going to read that because I'm talking about Daniel with this thing, but I would like to look at verse 16, 17, and 18, Daniel 3, because they were going to be cast in the fiery furnace. And the king liked these young men. He liked all of them. And he gives them an opportunity to repent, quote unquote. You didn't hear the music, which I'm sure was loud as all get out. And he said, well, we'll play it again, and when we do, you can bow down then. And of course, they answer him. Verse 16, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego answered and said, O king, Nebuchadnezzar, we are not careful to answer you in this matter. If it be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it be known to you, O king, we will not serve your gods, nor worship the golden image which you have set up. Again, Nebuchadnezzar had a temper, and heat up the furnace hotter. Let's throw these guys in there. Nobody's going to talk to me like that. And their answer was, live or die. God is God. Doesn't make any difference. If he delivers us, fine. If he doesn't. The only question I would ask you on this one, though, is where was Daniel? Why wasn't Daniel there? Daniel wasn't bowing down to any image, but he's not here. Why? I don't know. I believe, though, knowing how God works and having seen do different things, I think God was testing Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego without Daniel, because it's real easy to stand behind somebody that you know is with God and hide him. Mr. Armstrong was in front of me. Didn't worry about it. I knew there were angels on the wings of the plane. I didn't care. We flew down the Sinai once with MiGs on one side and Phantoms on the other, both wanting us to go down, and we just went down the Red Sea and ignored them. But I had no fear of anything because I'm with Mr. Armstrong. And I wonder if the three of them, if God's saying, okay, how do you do without Daniel? If Daniel's there, we can all stand up together, but without him. So sometimes God tests you on your own to see how you're going to handle something. And I think that's what happened in that, because it is easier to sign behind a leader. Mr. Armstrong, when people would talk to him and say, well, I think this, he would always say, I don't care what you think. What does God think? And that's where our mindset has to be too, is what does God think? Will we stand up by ourselves, all alone, if we have to? And I pray we do, because we have to stand up in a very evil world. We put sin out of our lives, which is against the grain. This world doesn't even see it as sin. In fact, they see sin as being against people that sin. And so we have to stand up. Daniel and his friends caused Nebuchadnezzar to know the true God. Do you have people, they see you, do they know the true God? To even praise him. Daniel 4:1, we read about King Nebuchadnezzar praising them after this incident with the fiery furnace. And he says to them, verse 1, to all the people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I thought it good to show the signs and wonders that the high God has wrought toward me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom. His dominion is from generation to generation. That's Nebuchadnezzar saying that. But he had a rather short-term memory, and it wouldn't last, which is typical in a lot of cases with people. And so we learn that, verse 4, Nebuchadnezzar was at rest in his house and flourishing in his palace. And he saw a dream which made him afraid. And the thoughts on his bed and the visions of his head troubled him. And he made a decree for all the wise men of Babylon to come. And this time he tells them the dream. And I think they probably, when they first heard the dream about this great massive tree and everything's feeding under it and the animals are under it and everything's wonderful, I'm sure they were thinking, oh yeah, we can interpret this one. Yeah, God, that's you, Nebuchadnezzar. Of course, then the vision is the tree gets cut down, a band put around it, everybody flies. No, I don't know how to tell you that. So they wouldn't tell him what the dream was. And the king wanted to know. And they couldn't do it. And so now, again, what does he do? Calls in Daniel, verse 8. At last Daniel came in before me, whose name was Belteshazzar, according to the name of his God, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And before him I told the dream, saying this, Master of the magicians, because I know the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and no secret troubles you, tell me the vision of my dream, what I have seen, and the interpretation thereof. Again, a very odd dream. There are visions in my head, and again he tells about the tree growing strong and all the things. We don't need to read that, but they hew down the tree, and then a band is placed around it, and then it starts sprouting up again after 7 times pass over it. Verse 16, let the heart be changed from a man's heart, let the beast heart be given to him, and let 7 times pass over him. Verse 18, the dream I, King Nebuchadnezzar, have seen. Now you, O Belteshazzar, declare the interpretation. For as much as all the wise men in my kingdom are not able to make it known to me, but you are able, because the Spirit of God is in you. Nebuchadnezzar could recognize Daniel special, that God gave him something special. The other wise men didn't even attempt it. Mr. Armstrong used to tell me I had discernment, and I always told him, God, if I have it, God gave it to me, but I said most of the time it's not discernment. I was a 10-year-old kid, and I went to stay at the homes of a lot of the evangelists because I was the same age as their kids, and they used to complain all the time at the breakfast table about things that were wrong, and all I was doing was repeating what they'd said, so I didn't consider that discernment. That was just passing on information, and the department heads and evangelists didn't figure this 10-year-old kid would be their boss someday, and so I'm sure they wish they hadn't said anything at the breakfast table, but again, God does give you things, and again, no one expected me to be in that position. But I had learned you had to be careful of pride, because Moses, the meekest man on earth, when he said, do I have to bring water out of this rock, and cost him going into the promised land. So you never take credit for something that God gives to you, whether he did. And again, Daniel, he knew this, and he never took credit. He always gave credit to God, and God gave Daniel wisdom. But Daniel had to know how to use it. And this dream wasn't good news. He knew that for Nebuchadnezzar, what was going to happen. And oftentimes we have to deliver news. If you've ever had to deliver news in a controversy situation where you knew they were going to accept it, it was difficult. It's a dilemma. And that Daniel had this. Verse 19, we read about his thoughts. Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, was astonished for an hour, and his thoughts troubled him. The king spoke and said, Belteshazzar, let not the dream or the interpretation trouble you. And he said, my lord, the dream be to those that hate you, the interpretation to your enemies. And he tells him, yeah, you're the tree, and you're going to be cut down. But God's not going to take the kingdom from you. Eventually you'll come back, but you're going to, have dew on you. It's like the dew, and your hands are going to be like an animal driven from men. And again, it was difficult for him to say that. And he didn't want to tell that, but he tried to do it wisely. When I became Mr. Armstrong's aide, the one thing I did was do a study on all the servants of God and all the things they had to do, because I thought, I'm going to be put in situations where I need to know what to say. And I read, Nathan the prophet. I thought, did God tell him the story to tell David? Because David had just killed a man to hide a sin. And if Nathan comes in and says, well, David, you did this terrible thing, does anybody know about it? No. Okay. I don't know. Did God tell him, or did wisdom? I read about Abraham's servant. And one job I wouldn't want is to find a wife for my boss. Man, that's a losing proposition. And of course Elisha's servant who went to Naaman and took the goods and got leprosy. I certainly didn't want to get leprosy. And so, I tried to learn, God help me to say things in the right way. And I tried to with Mr. Armstrong, and I didn't always succeed. I got fired a few times, but that was kind of part of the job too. So you live and learn. But Daniel didn't want the king to go through this. And he told Nebuchadnezzar, verse 27, he says, Nebuchadnezzar says, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off from your sins with righteousness, then your iniquities. Show mercy to the poor. And it may be lengthening of your tranquility and lengthening of your days, that you won't have to go through what this dream is about. And again, Daniel responded. He gave advice, and he was humble to it and tried to stop the outcome and make the king see it, this king who had taken his people captive. And that's the thing. We have to look at people in the world, all of them. We're trying to help. And in verse 29, we see at the end of 12 months, the king's walking in the palace, and the king spoke and said, is this not the great Babylon I have built for the house of the kingdom by my might and my power, for the honor of my majesty? And while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice from heaven said, King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it's spoken, the kingdom has departed from you. And the vision, the dream he had, came to pass, and they drove him from men. And it was fulfilled. Those things happened to him. You can't have that attitude of pride. Pride has caused all the splits in the churches. If we had humility, we wouldn't have splits. We wouldn't have those things. And that's sad when you see people do that. Have you ever given good advice and it wasn't taken? I have. Have to say something they don't want to hear. Again, probably not as severe as this. You're not going to be killed for it. But there are times when it happened. When I became his aide, I had to tell Mr. Armstrong things he didn't want to hear. The way some of the things were done that shouldn't have been done. And a lot of things he didn't know. He was shocked at some of the things I told him. But I'd promised him I'd always tell him the truth. And so I did. Because I had heard in the airplane men tell him the things they wanted to tell him. They gave him advice, and they left out parts of it. I saw a lot of bad decisions because of incomplete information or even lies. And I had to tell him some of the things that happened, and he cried at times even because he felt responsible. And I said, look, you didn't know what they were saying, what they were doing, but it was tough. Again, I didn't always get it right for him because sometimes he just didn't want to hear some of the things that I had to tell him, even though he knew it was true. But and I got fired a few times for that too. But he couldn't, at the time I worked for him, he was legally blind and he couldn't work very hard without me. So he'd sit there and twiddle his thumbs until he got tired, and then he'd call me back and say, "What do you mean by this?" And we'd talk. But there are times when you're put in a position where you have to be tactful, and in those times you feel like you're walking through the valley of the shadow of death, and you have to realize God is with you. Daniel was always helpful, but it wasn't always appreciated. And we see for a time that Daniel was even forgotten. I don't know exactly what happened during those years, from the time he was captive, when he was right there with the king, to later on in life when we come to the next chapter. And he had a reprieve, in a sense. I wonder if he was retired or put out to pasture as he got older. We don't really know. But he was probably glad to be out of the limelight. I know I was. When Mr. Armstrong died, Mr. Armstrong made me promise to do a lot of things, and I kept my promises to him. One of them was he made me promise to tell Mr. DeKoch when he was wrong, and I did. Mr. DeKoch didn't want to hear that either at times. In fact, most of the time, because he made up a lot of things that never happened. and stories that you read, which is tough. But I never quit serving God. I kept my promises to Mr. Armstrong, all the ones he made me make before he died. And whether it was pleasant or not, that didn't make any difference. When I was transferred to the college in Texas, I thought I had won the lottery in the sense, because, man, I had a house and I was on a lake and I had children. 12 years, we didn't have kids. I didn't want to be an absentee parent. And I figured Christ was going to come before Mr. Armstrong died. We'd never have children. Mr. Armstrong thought it was the greatest thing in the world, having children. He kept asking me, when are you going to have kids? And I'd say, when are you going to quit flying? And he finally quit flying, and I had kids. So, or my wife did. She did all the work. But that's the thing you live with. And so the things that happened, I hated the fact the church went into apostasy. I didn't like what happened to it. But the thing is, God was doing something. And I had to stand back, and I wanted to scream and shout. And I remember I was going to go public pretty quickly, and I opened my Bible randomly, and I came to King Rehoboam's going to attack Jeroboam, and for taking the kingdom, and God says, don't do it, it's of me. And I thought, okay, God, you're separating the wheat and the chaff, and I'm trying to keep it together. So I'll just shut up, and I'll tell Mr. Koch when he's wrong, and if people call me personally, I'll tell them what's going on, but I'm not going to go public. And I didn't until after he died, because he always could have repented, and my promise was to help him, and I tried to as best I could. And so going to Texas for me was great. When he removed me from all the positions and things, I thought it was wonderful. He didn't want to send me in the field because he was afraid I might poison some of you members with the truth. And instead of let me go to the students, where I could poison all the students every year, a whole new set every year, and tell them all the things that happened. And I had all the students to my house every year and everything. We had a boat and a lake, and we played, and then I had pictures on the wall of all the travels, and they'd ask questions, and I could explain what was going on with the church and some of the things. And I was able to stay there and help the kids till the college closed, because they couldn't fire me. Because I was a business teacher. I did my degree after Vassar. I did my degree in finance and management, and religion was my opinion because of accreditation. Therefore, they fired all the theology faculty that didn't agree with the religion, because that was the party line and that was the church school. But in business, religion was my opinion. Therefore, I could counsel all the students I wanted to and set them straight. So I stayed there till the college closed to be able to help the students. A lot of people ask me, why didn't you quit and go with United or others early? And I said, nobody can help the kids. And so we had, in Big Sandy, we had 8 or 10 ministers already in United, so they didn't need another one. And besides, none of them could talk to any of the faculty or students that were trying to hold to the truth. And so you get in positions like that at times, but I loved Texas. It was a reprieve. I got to raise my kids and have fun with them, and I thought life was good, and I figured I'd retire there. And then Denny Luker called me up and asked me to be treasurer, and I got put back in the fire again. And so, but that happens, and that's what happens. You don't know where Daniel was in those intervening years from chapter 5, but he was called back. Daniel knew God never left him, and whether you have a job, one of the problems in the church I always saw was too many people wanted to be Joshua and nobody wanted to be Caleb. And to me, Caleb was great. You do your job, you do it well, you come back. God says, hey, you're going to have a descendant forever. Oh, great. Somebody here, maybe a descendant from Caleb. And then you give the promise to Joshua and you go home. And that's a good thing to do. But no, too many people want to be the leader. And that's a sad thing. So we read in chapter 5, of course, is the story of the handwriting on the wall. Belteshazzar makes a feast. He pulls out the vessels from the temple of God. He's drinking in them and having this big party. As such, in verse 5, the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, wrote over against the candlesticks upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And his countenance was changed, his thoughts were troubled, his joints were loosed, and his knees smote together. This was scary. If a hand came and wrote on the wall right now, yeah, I'd be scared too. And everybody saw it, and it was their eyes were fixed on it. And he, again, what do? Asked for the Chaldeans, the soothsayers, and whoever shall read this writing and show the interpretation shall be clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then came all the wise men, but they could not read the writing nor make known the interpretation. Here we get another problem. And Belteshazzar was greatly troubled. His countenance was changed, and his lords were astonished. He didn't call for Daniel because he didn't know about Daniel. But at verse 10, the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came to the banquet house. The queen spoke and said, and again, it's probably the queen's mother, probably one of Nebuchadnezzar's wives that had been around for a while. It says, King, live forever, don't be troubled. Verse 11, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is the Spirit of the Holy God. And in the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him. And Nebuchadnezzar, your father, I say thy father made a master of the magicians, of the astrologers and Chaldeans. And forasmuch as an excellent spirit, and knowledge and understanding and interpretation of dreams, and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, let Daniel be called, and he'll show you the interpretation. So the old people still remembered. A lot of you remember the old days and things that happened and whatever. And this queen knew of Daniel. By this time, Daniel had to be fairly old. He had to be 70 or 80 years old at least, because we know that night it changed to Persia in 533. So we got a lot of years that have gone by. And again, sometimes you're forgotten for a time. Are you content? Are you concerned? Paul, I've learned how to be abased, learned how to abound. Always be content. And Daniel, he didn't want anything of Belteshazzar's offer. He didn't care if he was going to be king. He'd be on that. You get old enough pretty soon, you realize you don't need anything in this world. And Daniel was content. And with God, you have to come into a point in your life where you're content, where you realize God's in charge. You've fought enough wars. You've suffered at times, yet you've been delivered in one way or another. And live or die, you know who God is, and that's where you stay. And you finally understand, Psalms 23, that goodness and mercy will follow you all the days of your life. Daniel, again, at this time, felt it was over, but his reputation was known by some in Persia. And so that night, the Persians took over. Babylon was destroyed. But we see Daniel now, even as an old man, was used by Darius. Darius, the king of the Persians and Medes. In chapter 6, verse 1, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over his whole kingdom. Just like today, we have governors and provinces and counties, and he set up districts to give account. And over these 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was first, that the princes might give account to them, and the king should have no damage. There was corruption all over the place, always has been, and there was graft and taxes, and he wanted honest people, which is what most people want in their businesses. And so Darius trusted Daniel. Somehow his reputation had been passed down, and he was there. And it says Daniel, verse 3, was preferred above all the presidents and princes because an excellent spirit was in him. The king thought to set him over the whole realm. Again, this is another Joseph, another Esther and Mordecai and Daniel over the kingdom. All these things that happened. And he was preferred. And why preferred? Because of an excellent spirit, honest and integrity. The king wasn't stupid. He knew he needed somebody in charge who had that honesty and integrity. And again, tax collectors are notorious in the old days for ripping people off and taking things. And in Ambassador College, the projects that we had there, and I enjoyed, I ran most of the projects we had overseas. And every time the people, we were sending 20, 21-year-olds over, and young Americans mostly, and some Aussies and Brits and different people would go on these projects. But they were known for their honesty and integrity. And it always worked the same way. We'd send them over the first year, and usually they'd ask, can we keep them another year because they're so nice. We know you handpick these people. And I'd say, no, we'll send you somebody else. Don't worry about it. They'll be good. And the second year, you handpick these people too. And so by the third year, they'd just say, send us anybody. They figure by then we must be teaching something, right? And so they would do it. And last time I was in Nepal, Queen Aishwarya, she called me and she said, we have so much corruption in Nepal. I said, we get $92 million in foreign aid. Can your students run our $92 million of foreign aid? There are Daniels today. I always tell our young people there are Daniels today. You can be a Daniel. It may not be running a king, but people see that. They like that. They trust people that have integrity, and they recognize that. And so, again, that's a special thing. It's still happening now. The stories of the past are stories of today. And we still have the same God, the same Christ who died for us doing the same thing for us. He knew when he delivered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that he was going to save them. He knew when he came that God the Father could save him, but he knew he had to die. And so he knows what it's like to go through that. And but sometimes when you're honest, it evokes anger. Sometimes people get jealous, and you see that when someone's honest because they can't cheat, they can't rise, they can't bribe people. And Daniel, they couldn't take advantage of him. They couldn't cheat. And so it made them jealous, and they envied him, and because he held them to account. And oftentimes we get put in those positions. Verse 4, we read about it. The presidents and princes sought to find occasion against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no occasion or fault, for as much as he was faithful, neither was there any error or fault found in him. Could this be said about you? If they looked at your life and studied you, would they say that you can't find fault with them? They're honest. They were looking for ways to trap him. You couldn't bribe him. They were jealous. They wanted money and power, and they couldn't. And people are often jealous when you do what's right, and they often try to destroy someone who has character, and people that want to be promoted rather than improve their ethics and their ability to be noticed for proper things. I always say Satan's way is to push everybody down and you look taller. God's way is you take a step up and you bring people with you. You take another step up and you bring them with you. And that's what you try to do, is to help people get in the kingdom and serve one another. You do what Christ did. You die for them. But these had spies, and they were looking for anything to accuse Daniel. That's what they were trying to do. There was nothing. And that should be that way with you, with me. And now the only way they could stop Daniel is found in the next verse. I think it's a great thing to think about. Then said these men, we shall not find any occasion against Daniel except we find it against him concerning the laws of his God. They had to trap him for his religious beliefs, his practices. Daniel would never desert God, and they knew that. And again, God has to know that of you and me to give us eternal life. He has to test us from all sides. That's why he puts you through the stresses he does, because he wants to know, like Abraham, now I know. And he has to know that about us as well. And Daniel knew that. And they knew that about Daniel. And people can know what you're going to do. These stories helped me get through the things I had to go through. And we're soon to go through the worst Holocaust the world has ever known, the Great Tribulation. Are we ready for that? And I think God's going to do some very special things for us in those times, more than we can know. So they assembled, verse 6. The presidents, the princes assembled together to be the king and said to him, flattery, flattery, Darius, live forever. They always put flattery. I saw a lot of flattery. They tried to flatter Mr. Armstrong at times. I saw a lot of people that work for world leaders try to flatter. And so they brought a bunch of people in to set their thing in motion, and they made it sound good. Verse 7, all the presidents of the kingdom, the governors, the princes, the counselors, the captors, they've all consulted together to make a royal statute, to make a firm decree. Whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or man for 30 days except you, king, he shall be cast into the den of lions. You're the king, and everybody needs to know that and respect that. And flattery, flattery. So king, establish a decree, sign the writing, that it be not changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which alters not. Wherefore King Darius signed the writing and the decree. They knew the king liked Daniel, and they wanted to make sure he was taken out. They had to make it permanent. Do you think that doesn't happen today? Mr. Armstrong liked me. Darius liked Daniel. It's interesting when you have to see the intent behind it, and God may let you hang out to dry at times, at least in your opinion you are, to take care of the outcome. But you have to be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Live or die, God is there. He will help you. Now it was Daniel's turn. And Daniel, verse 10, it says, now when Daniel knew the writing was signed, he absolutely knew that they signed it. He wasn't trying to hide. He went to his house, windows open in his chamber toward Jerusalem, kneeled on his knees 3 times a day and prayed, gave thanks before his God as he had done before. He kept his routine. He kept his spiritual life in order. And they knew what Daniel was going to do. And they were ready for it. Verse 11, these men assembled, found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. People should know what you're going to do. They have to know that. In 1980, Mr. Armstrong was still in Tucson. We had the receivership that tried to take over the church in 1979. And there were some things going on wrong. There was a man who was trying to take over the church basically at that time. My wife had worked up in the office up there, and she had to quit working. She was working for Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong, in the fourth floor, his office. Now, he was in Tucson. He didn't know some of the things that were going on, but she was in the executive offices. And she finally came to me and said, I have to quit the job, because the administrative aide had gone to her for the treasurer and said, we'd get along a lot better. Your problem is you're in the church. If you weren't in the church, we'd get along better. And she came to me and she said, I either quit the job or quit the church. And I said, quit the job. And she said, well, that's going to damage you? It's going to make it harder? I said, probably, but don't worry, I'll be fine. I'll go through it. I've been there before. And so she did. She quit. Got a job on the outside, and God was good to her, gave her a really nice job. I've seen people who tried to stop things in the church that were wrong. But I've also seen sometimes their motives were wrong. They did it because they wanted to be David slaying Goliath and get rewarded for it. And oftentimes you can do the right thing for the wrong reason. And God knows that when that happens. I saw things that were going wrong. And I decided that I prayed, God, you need to do something here. And so what I did, I prayed and asked God, I said, if you want Mr. Armstrong to know what's happening here, have him answer these questions, or ask me these questions. And I had specific questions I wanted him to ask me. And if he did, I'd tell him. If he didn't, I wouldn't. 'Cause I'd seen other people try to do things and they were gone. And so I didn't. It wasn't my job to remove anybody. It wasn't my job to be a hero. But I was in a position to know some things that I thought were wrong. And so I simply prayed and asked God to ask me these questions. And if he does, I'll tell him. 10 days after I prayed that, I was called into the offices by the same people that had gone to my wife. And they told me, they said, we know you're upset. And we know what you know. We know what you're going to say. You're going to tell the truth. There were 6 of us in that troop. We're going to lie. We're going to say what he wants to hear. We'll destroy you, your family, your marriage, everything you stand for. And they meant it. They really did. And I told them I wasn't planning to say anything. And I wasn't. They were still afraid of me. And so they decided to remove me from the plane. But they couldn't do that because Mr. Armstrong hired me, so they told me that Mr. Armstrong wanted me to go finish a law degree and accounting degree, which made sense with the receivership because of the lawyers. They didn't know what Mr. Armstrong did. They were kind of up to the judge, Mr. Armstrong's over there preaching Christ, or whatever. And they didn't understand us. So it didn't make any but it made sense to me. If that's what he wants, fine. That's what I can do. And so I went and took more classes. And because I was there, the receivership, it was strange. I mean, the deputy receiver told me, he said, next year you'll be keeping Christmas. We're changing your religion. And they fired Mr. Armstrong. It was amazing what happened at that time. And to be in the office and hear them do that. So having a degree, that's what he wanted, I would do it. So I took more classes, and I hired a young man that they wanted on the jet. He wasn't in the church. They wanted someone not in the church because they didn't like people that knew the truth in that case. And I thought it was fine. And over the next couple months, I taught him the job. A few months later, Mr. Armstrong had a trip planned overseas. He flew back to Pasadena from Tucson and was going on a trip. And so I helped load the luggage and did the things. I wrote him a letter that I gave to Daryl to give to him because I was wishing him well for the trip. Helped load the luggage. Daryl goes up and serves him on the plane. Mr. Armstrong looks at him and who are you? And he saw him, Daryl. He said, where's Aaron? And Daryl said, he's not flying. He said, well, why not? And Daryl said, well, I don't know, but he gave me a letter. So he gives Mr. Armstrong a letter. Mr. Armstrong is mad. He reads the letter and he's very mad. And Mr. Armstrong's second wife, who was semi in the church at that time. So things were going bad, but there were things going on. But Mr. Armstrong didn't know where she stood at that point in time. And so she said, what did you give to Mr. Armstrong? And he said, a letter from Aaron. And she gets on the flight phone and calls the treasurer who was trying to take over the church and says, Aaron gave Mr. Armstrong a letter. He's mad. And when Mr. Armstrong landed in Hawaii, he had several feet of telexes with all these evil things that I had done and whatever. And basically they did try to destroy me and my family, my marriage, everything there. And Mr. Armstrong gets these and he calls me up. He says, get over here right now. You see, he was mad not because I'd done anything or written anything. He was mad because they never told him that they took me off the plane. He didn't tell me to do those degrees. And so they had lied to me. And in my letter, I just simply said, Mr. Armstrong, I understand you want me to do these degrees. Classes have always been easy for me. And if the church needs that, that's what I'll do. But if you need me for your campaigns, I'll be praying for you for the campaign in the Philippines and in Hong Kong and Japan. And if you need me, call. That's all I'd written. Really nice, pleasant letter. Nothing in there. But they thought I had said all these things. And they were writing their counteraction to everything I supposedly said. So I fly over there. He says, get over here right now. I fly in there. And he asked me the very questions I'd prayed. And I'm thinking, man, Gideon got 2 shots at this. Should I tell him? But I prayed and I asked God to tell him. So I told him. I answered the questions. And it was a strange thing to go through that. And immediately I had to answer everything and read that. And I had to read the telexes of all this garbage about me to him. If you were on a bad job, read stuff that people write about you to your boss. But again, he asked me the questions I had prayed. And they knew what I was going to say. And I knew that, and they knew that, and they knew what he wanted to hear as well. Sad position to be in, but these things still happen today. Daniel 6:12, they came near, spoke before the king concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed a decree that every man that shall ask a petition of God or man within 30 days, save you, O king, shall be cast to the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which alters not. And they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, which is of the children of the Judah, he regards you not, king, nor the decree that you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. What are you going to do about it? They wanted Daniel gone. It was sad. He liked Daniel. The king, in verse 14, he heard these words. He was displeased with himself. He set his heart on Daniel to deliver him. He labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. He liked Daniel. He didn't know what to do. How do I get him out of this? I really screwed up. That happens. People do things. The king wanted to change it. Mr. Armstrong, I told him, I said, these telexes are all untrue. None of this is true. And he wanted to believe me, but he stated the old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire. And I said, lawyers say, throw enough mud, some will stick. And I said, these things are difficult. I had to trust God. I couldn't prove anything. There were 6 of them, 1 of me. And I couldn't prove what they were saying was wrong. The biggest test by God is when you're alone. There's no one there standing up for you. You can't do anything about it. And that's where it is. In verse 15 of Daniel 6, these men assembled to the king and said, King, know that the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or statute of the king can be changed. During that trip, I was kept in a separate hotel. They didn't want me talking to Mr. Armstrong. I knew too much. I knew all the things that had gone on and was wrong. Mr. Armstrong, he broke his typewriter to call me over to the hotel, and he said, Aaron, did anybody see you come in? I said, I don't think so. He said, they're trying to kill me. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, last night they kept me up till 2 o'clock in the morning telling me how bad you were and how come you hadn't disfellowshipped me and thrown me out with all this proof we've given to you. And he said, they want to be at my bedside saying, if I die, who's in charge? And he said, if you can, try to sneak out, so that they don't do it again to me. And I said, Mr. Armstrong, if it helps you for me to be gone, send me away. I didn't ask to fly. I didn't ask for any of this. But I said, the only condition I give you is I'm telling you the truth. But if it helps you, send me away. And he said, no, I know your attitude's right and their attitude's wrong. But And he said, I'll have to get to the bottom of this. Again, I was walking through the valley of the shadow of death. And it was difficult. They kept sending telexes to him. They kept writing things up. They got people saying things I could not believe. They got people to lie. And every day I had to read these telexes. When he'd call me over, I got fired 7 times and thrown out of the church 3 times in 31 days. He didn't know what to do. I mean, it was difficult because there were things, they'd listen at the door. And he was, basically deaf. He didn't have hearing aids at that time. And I'd tell him, Mr. Armstrong, they're listening at the door. I always say, please don't tell me this, because the next day he'd get a telex quoting him word for word. And I didn't tell anybody. You had to tell them. I said, Mr. I didn't tell anybody. Well, how did they know? I said, they're listening at the door. What? They're listening at the door. He'd waddle over there and they'd be gone. And I'm saying, oh, great, here we go again. And but I explained the truth. And he would tell me, he said, your attitude's right and their attitude's wrong, but why are they saying these things about you? Why are they writing this? And I said, Mr. Armstrong, I've flown with you for 7 years. Have you ever gotten a telex about me, good or bad, in 7 years? And well, no. I said, you think someone's going to wake up today and say, hey, I think I'll write something about Aaron Dean. He's a good guy. Let's just, they don't even know where you are. And there was no internet or phones. It was just telexes, and they wouldn't know the hotel he was in anyway. And no way to know that. And I said, this is solicited. It's not about that. And but at the end of the trip, again, Mr. Armstrong, he said, he demanded, they were demanding of him that they get rid of me. With all this proof we've given, you've got to get rid of him. And he said, I don't know the truth of this, but they want you gone. And they wanted Daniel gone. Chapter 6, verse 16, the king commanded, they brought Daniel, they cast him into the den of lions. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God whom you serve continually, he'll deliver you. I think he said that hopefully. He didn't know what was going to happen. He really didn't. And the stone was brought, laid on the mouth of the den. The king sealed it with his own signet, with the signet of the Lord's. The purpose might not be changed concerning Daniel. Again, they wanted him gone permanently, forever. And that's what happened. They wanted him gone. Verse 18, the king went to his palace, passed the night fasting. Again, he liked them. Mr. Armstrong liked me, but he didn't know what was true, and neither were the instruments of the music brought before him. His sleep went from him. The king rose early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. And he came and he cried with a lamentable voice, which means he didn't really think Daniel was alive. He was lamenting, and he said, and the king spoke and said, Daniel, O Daniel, the servant of the living God, is your God whom you serve continually able to deliver you from the lions? Had he really believed his own statement that God would deliver you? I don't think so. And Daniel said to the king, live forever. My God has sent an angel and has shut the lion's mouth, and they that have not hurt me. For as much as before him innocency was found in me, and also before you, O king, I have done no hurt. I remember telling Mr. Armstrong, I haven't done any of these things, but send me away. On the flight home, Mr. Armstrong said, I'll get to the bottom of this, Aaron. I don't know what's true or not, and they've written all this stuff and everything, but I know your attitude's right, and I'll get to the bottom of it. So we landed. I put the plane away, and I got home at about 3 o'clock, 3:15. 15 minutes after I was home, phone rings. It's Mr. Armstrong. He says, Aaron, leave town immediately. Your life's been threatened. I spent a month jumping motels, looking over my shoulder. This is inside the church. Never expected it inside the church. Verse 23, the king was exceedingly glad for him, commanded they should take Daniel out of the den. And they took him out, and no hurt was on him. And he commanded to throw the people who accused him in. And they were eaten before they even hit the ground. Often God's people fall into the very traps that the other people set. Daniel had done nothing to them. King David never asked it against the people who told him he was wrong. It's a key. God knows when, how, and if to save you. If something needs to be done, and you have to have faith and keep a good attitude and wait for God. And whether you live or die, it makes no difference. God is still God. And he'll help you miraculously if that's what he's doing in your life. You never try to take matters into your own hands. And that's what people that don't believe in God do. They try to take matters in their own hands. And sometimes we do that. Abraham did. That's why we have Ishmael. Others did too. and that's wrong. Mr. Armstrong saw what was going on, and he saw that, and he let them think they were winning. He let them exile me, and he was afraid because they had threatened me, and they had ex-CIA and FBI agents in the Rolodex files that I'd worked up there. I knew exactly what was there, so my wife. And so, it was a legitimate threat, and I kept moving around all the time. And Mr. Armstrong, during this time, he liked to take drives, so he'd take a drive, and they let him. He was afraid that they had him in prison. They put bars on his house for security purposes, and he told me, he said, I think they were trying to keep me in jail. But he went out and he'd go to a phone booth and he'd call the legal office in Pasadena, and he set up the Council of Elders. And their sole purpose was to name a successor if he died at that point. And he went back after this and told the man who was trying to take over that he had set up a Council of Elders and that was their job. And at that point, they realized they couldn't take over, and that's when he called me back to fly again. He said, Aaron, I really missed the food and the plane. You need to come back. So I did. And it got worse. But that's the way life is. Again, he saw through what was going on and those events. And again, people can say things, and you may not be able to prove them, but God works it out. And later on, I became his aide after that and served him until he died in 1986, 38 years ago. Chapter 6, verse 25, Darius wrote to the people, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth, peace be multiplied. I make a decree. In every dominion of my kingdom, men tremble and fear before the God of Daniel, for he is the living God, steadfast forever. In his kingdom, that which cannot be destroyed, his dominion even to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works his signs and wonders in heaven and in earth, who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. As always, it has to be about God. And Daniel always did that, praising God for what God alone can do. As a young man, I knew the world was going to attack us. We were always told, be ready for persecution. That was one thing. And so I was ready for persecution. Boy, if the Romans ever come after me and they try to make me eat pork or try to make me break the Sabbath, I'm not going to do it. I never expected it from inside the church, and it was difficult. People that didn't know the truth, I expected it from, but people that did, just like you. But then we find out that it is. I thought certainly it wouldn't be in God's church, and I'm sure the apostles thought that. When they were talking about Diotrephes and Ananias and Sapphira and all the people at Demas who forsaken me, that was strange to them. You have the truth. Why is this happening? I think that's why they talk so frustratingly about those who changed the gospel and tried to deceive others. And it was difficult. People are talented, and they can rise in organization. And a lot of people do the right things because they want to look good. But inside their heart, it's not there. They wanted power and position. The early church had no history to look back on. That's what frustrated them because, man, Christ is coming back pretty soon, and we're all ready and baptized 5,000 people. We're healing people. Everything's going on. And it was exciting. But that's something that was expected. They didn't know that there'd be a falling away. Again, can you stand up against society when it's wrong? Can you stand up in the church if someone does you wrong? And not necessarily intentionally. It could be unintentional. Either way. Will you let God take care of that? Will you forgive, or will you carry a grudge? I like all the people that in my past, I wish they all make it in the kingdom. A lot of them, I think, never had God's Spirit, and they'll come up in the second resurrection. And then they'll wonder, I was so close. But others, they get bitter, and I pray for those that are bitter. But you have to let God do it. And again, I use the stories of the Bible to save me, because it's always a way you can look at something in your life and it matches up something in the Bible, and you can use God to help you do that. I imagine, Paul talked about the things that happened to him, being shipwrecked, a stone and things. He wasn't trying to glory him. He's telling people God does these things and God will deliver you. And if he doesn't, it's still the truth. You still have to do what he says. They dealt with a lot of people. At 21, when I was asked to fly and work with the people of God, I didn't really realize what I was going to have to go through at that time. But it didn't make any difference. I have a picture of the Council of Elders. Mr. Armstrong died in 86, and it's on my wall. And I look up there, and half of those men who had been ministers for 30, 40 years, taught the truth, gave it up. Others have started their own churches. God has tested everyone to find out, are you following God? Are you trusting him? It's an evil world, and you have to be. It wasn't any. We have a Babylon today. We live in it. And we have to do as Daniel and be that. Tell the truth. Now those people, all the people on the council are dead except my wife and I. And thankfully, we're 20, 30 years younger than they were. But God's their judge, not me. But they gave it up, and that hurts for me. Again, God gives us his truth. We have to believe that. And there'll be problems. There's always problems among the church, and there's always problems in the world. The world, we expect it. We don't always expect it inside. And these things have happened in UCG. People have decided they should be in charge. They've started their own churches. It's sad to witness that, and I often wonder, do they read the same book I do? Do they really believe God's in charge, that he can change things back if they're supposed to be in charge? And it's sad to witness it happen and lose friends and family, because it hurts. It hurts all of us. It hurts families be split apart. But we always have to recognize that, like Jude, verse 4, says that people do creep in unaware. There are people that crept in the first century, people crept in now. There'll always be people that Satan tries to put in to stir up the people of God, to make them angry, to get mad at each other or whatever. And it's said, ours has not been a problem with doctrine. Ours this time has been more a problem with position and power and money. But they don't seem to believe that God can make it right and that he'll deliver them. We have a past and present history of failures, unintentional or deliberate. I've seen both. Christ made it clear that it's not easy to follow God in Satan's world. It's not easy to put all the sin out of your life. It's not easy to face the things that happen. Mr. Armstrong told me stories in his early life, things he had to do to encourage me. And the stories are about deliverance from God. It's not about us. There's no magical powers any of us have, but it's about God. And if he's not in your life, then you have nothing. You can make things look and appear like they are. Satan appears as an angel of light. Sometimes people appear as ministers of righteousness. But if they slip, I've seen so many people give away their crown because, well, if that's what the church is, I don't want any part of it. Separate salvation from people. If you don't do that, you'll be gone. No one can take your crown, but you can give it away. And that's one of the things that we have to realize, that don't give your crown away. What someone else does is not important. You have to be right with God. You have to do the right thing and live or die. It's not a health, wealth gospel. There will be times that we're tested because God has to know about you. He has to be able to say, now I know. And that is a hard thing to do. The stories help the disciples understand. The apostles told the ups and downs in the church. Mr. Armstrong told me of them. I pass these on to you for the same thing, because God will deliver you if you're in the right attitude. And again, if he doesn't, hey, the next step's the kingdom. But if you give up your salvation because of other people, then you've lost your crown, and that's not it. Again, you can live godly. You can ask God for help. You can be that light. You can be that one that, hey, he's not going to change except it's against his God. And whether people say things good or bad about you, it's irrelevant. We all need good examples of character and endurance, and that's why God gave us the scriptures. And he's answered those things, and so many people I've met in the church are fine examples of those very things. They should let our young people in college have had to stand up against their professors. And that makes a big difference in your life when that happens. And people respect people of values, but it takes some time. Doesn't mean they agree with you, but God can use you to be a light to bring somebody in to the church. And you can set a pattern for others, whether they're inside the church or outside the church. It's irrelevant. We need those examples. And Jesus, the head of the church, he said through Peter, 1 Peter 2:12, one last scripture, I'll do that. He says, having your conversation honest among the Gentiles, whereas they speak evil of you as evildoers, may your good works, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. Daniel did this for the kings of Babylon and Persia. You can do it for the people around you. And that's what God expects you to do. And when you do that, then you'll understand the last verse of Psalms 23. Surely goodness and mercy will be with you all the days of your life, and you will be in the house of the Lord forever. It's been good to be with you. Michigan's a beautiful state. It can make me jealous, but there's lots of beautiful places, and people make a place. It's not the place, it's the people. So I appreciate being with you today. Hope you have a good rest of the unleavened bread.